Continuing education knows that at the end, students want to graduate.
We believe that there's an option for every student.
We are there to help students and serve them. It's our mission.
And education is transformational. It changes lives.
Good afternoon. My name is Hannah Schooldaughter and I am the Conference on World Affairs Keynote Student Ambassador. I'm also a student at the University of Colorado Boulder studying mechanical engineering and political science. Thank you for joining us for One Town at a Time. Shannon Watts and Representative Neguse discuss ending gun violence. Today, I'm so honored to bring Shannon Watts, the founder of Moms Demand Action, and Congressman Joe Neguse of Colorado District 2 to the Conference on World Affairs. Watts and Neguse both have a long history surrounding gun safety legislation at the state, local, and national levels. They both also share roots in beautiful Boulder, Colorado. They will be joined by Jayla Hemphill, a student activist with Students Demand Action, the Black Lives Matter movement, and a senior at Northfield High School in Denver, Colorado. This panel has been over 2 years in the making, and I really look forward to hearing what each of us can do to promote a safer America. Thank you for spending your afternoon with us.
Okay, welcome to our panel on common sense gun laws. My name is Jayla. I'm, as said, a senior at Northfield High School. I work with education, gun control and gun laws, and racial equity. I'd like to share with you all that much of the work that's gone into this panel has been the work of wanting to find the words. What an incredibly poignant and important time to have a conversation about gun laws, especially in light of the mass shooting in Boulder. To be quite honest with you all, and perhaps it's a shared sentiment, the Boulder shooting has weighed quite heavily in my own mind. I'd like to share that during the planning for this very panel, the Boulder shooting was taking place with Elise, who played a huge part in this planning, receiving a text from her daughter who was driving by the location, who said, "Mom, I think that there's a shooter in King Soopers." So of course, we all immediately took to social media and trying to figure out what's going on and looking for anything that would prove us wrong. However, we all know what happened next, and that moment alone seems so surreal. With that being said, I want to introduce you to our two panelists today. The first is going to be Shannon Watts. Shannon Watts is a mother of 5 who, prior to founding Moms Demand Action, was a stay-at-home mom and former communications executive. So as you can see, she does keep herself busy. Today, after the Sandy Hook tragedy, she started a Facebook group with the message that all Americans can and should do more to reduce gun violence. The online conversation turned into a grassroots movement of Americans that really are in the movement to fight for public safety measures that protect people from gun violence. Moms Demand Action and its partner, Students Demand Action, has established a chapter in every single state and is a part of Every Town for Gun Safety, the largest gun violence prevention organization in the country, with nearly 6 million supporters. In addition to her work with Moms Demand Action, Watts is an active board member of Emerge America, one of the nation's leading organizations for recruiting and training women to run for office. Her book, Fight Like a Mother, was released in 2019. In 2018, Watts was named as one of People's 25 Women Changing the World, and InStyle profiled her in its annual Badass Woman series. Next, I'd like to introduce you to Congressman Joe Neguse, who represents Colorado's 2nd District in the U.S. House of Representatives. He was elected to his first term in November 2018, becoming the first African-American member of Congress in Colorado history. He serves as a member of the House Judiciary Committee, House Natural Resources Committee, and the House Select Committee on the Climate Crisis. Today, the focus is common sense gun laws, and I assure you that Representative Neguse is an avid supporter of those too, advocating for stricter regulations on assault weapons, closing loopholes that threaten our communities, red flag laws, and background checks. Recently, Representative Neguse also played a large role in the executive actions passed by Joe Biden as of recent. Having called for the administration to enforce some level of regulation on assault-style firearms. I'd like to thank you both for joining us, of course. The work that you're doing and have done is so very, very important. That said, I'd like to welcome Shannon Watts to talk to us about her work and the growing movement for common sense gun laws.
Good afternoon, and thank you so much, Jayla, for that warm introduction and for all of your leadership through Students Demand Action. I know the mass shooting at the King Soopers in Boulder has meant more families have been forced into a club that no one wants to join. People who have buried their loved ones or have been shot and injured themselves because of our politicians' failure to act on this issue, to act on gun safety. I proudly called Boulder my home for many years, and my heart grieves for the community. No one should live in fear of being shot and killed as they go about their daily lives. And yet, in the United States, that's our reality. We're the only developed country in the whole world that lives and dies like this. And yet, some of our political leaders want you to believe nothing can change, but they're wrong. Americans, survivors, moms, students, grandparents, they are raising their voices like never before to demand that lawmakers act now. Thousands of them are traveling across the country right now as we have this conversation, and they are demanding their senators pass background checks on all gun sales. Moms Demand Action and Students Demand Action volunteers are sharing their stories. They're collecting messages and mementos and letters from gun violence survivors and American voters, and they are delivering them directly to senators. We're calling this a road trip for background checks, and it spans 10 days, 22 states, and 16,000 miles. And it will end at the Capitol to remind lawmakers exactly who they work for, us. That has never been more important because Americans are grieving. We should be celebrating the reopening of businesses and schools after a long, brutal year of COVID. And instead, Americans are wondering if gun violence will also be part of the return to normal. However, I truly believe that from grief can come righteous, transformative anger that has the power to force our leaders to act. It is way past time to address this public health crisis that kills 100 Americans every day and wounds over 230 others, even during a once-in-a-lifetime pandemic. In fact, despite COVID lockdowns, 2020 was one of the deadliest years on record in this country. And we've already seen too many communities grieve in 2021, including Boulder, including Atlanta, and so many other shootings that never make the headlines. Pundits and cynics, and of course the gun lobby, want us to believe nothing can change. Certainly they said that after Sandy Hook, and they're saying that again now. I'm here to tell you today that nothing could be further from the truth. We are standing at the crossroads of a generational, powerful change when it comes to addressing gun violence in this country. This moment that we're all living through right now holds more promise for life-saving action than ever before. We're seeing politicians have a change of heart on this issue, even in the reddest of states. We're seeing the NRA on the ropes, struggling to stay financially solvent and politically relevant as its dirty laundry is aired during a public bankruptcy trial this week. We've seen our laws change one state at a time, and we have seen Americans from all walks of life wake up and realize it is time for federal action that will save lives. 22 states and the District of Columbia now require background checks on all gun sales. And frankly, we're all only as safe as the closest state with the weakest gun laws. The House has also passed life-saving background check legislation in March, and so that's why the Senate has to act now. Unlike in the past when powerful special interests and corrupt politicians were able to sabotage their efforts, the gun safety movement is larger and stronger than the gun lobby. All of the work that Moms Demand Action and Students Demand Action volunteers have done over the past 8 years has led us to this moment. And that's what makes this time different, and this moment uniquely hopeful. We changed the course of history in 2020 by electing the strongest gun safety ticket ever to the White House. We helped flip Georgia's 2 Senate seats to give President Biden and Vice President Harris the support they need to pass life-saving gun laws. And we have presided over a sea change in the way Americans think about gun violence. Polling shows an overwhelming 93% of Americans support background checks on all gun sales. That includes 89% of Republicans and 87% of gun owners. In fact, voters rated background checks on par with creating jobs and passing another COVID relief package as priorities for Biden's the first 100 days in office. And just yesterday, hopefully you saw, the president announced a slate of executive actions on gun safety at an event in the Rose Garden. I opened my laptop the day after the Sandy Hook school shooting tragedy, and that's how I got involved in the gun violence prevention movement. I wanted to be able to tell my 5 kids, and someday maybe grandchildren, that I did something more than wring my hands and hope for change when their lives were threatened by violence. Now, nearly 9 years later, I can say that joining the gun violence prevention movement has also changed the course of my life. One of the greatest privileges as a Moms Demand Action volunteer is that I can stand alongside gun violence survivors and bear witness to their stories. It's what keeps me going when times get tough, and that has been often in this fight. And so to those survivors, I say today, we will not let you down. This time is different. This moment is powerful, and we will get this done. We will change the course of history and pass the most important gun safety legislation in a generation. We will make background checks on all gun sales the law of the land, close deadly loopholes, and protect women through a stronger reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act. And we will make our country safer. But it will require every single one of us to keep the pressure on in the coming days and weeks. It will require every single one of us to step up to save our democracy by calling and emailing and tweeting our lawmakers. It will take all of us dropping some of the tasks of our daily lives to make passing these laws a priority. We have to continue to show senators that we will have their backs when they act on gun safety, and when they don't, we will have their jobs. It is natural to feel overwhelmed. I know how easy it is to feel despair. But despite what you think, despite the lies that the NRA spins all the time, I want you to leave today knowing that we are winning. Yes, we're in the fight of our lives, but we will keep fighting until every single person in this country can live without the fear of gun violence. Thank you.
You have made so many great points and so many contributions to the fight against gun violence. I'd like to thank you for that, obviously, and the work that you've been doing and have done, for the life of myself and my peers, and especially children. I'd also like to remind the audience that questions can be submitted at any time through email at cwa@colorado.edu. And of course, welcome Joe Neguse to the stage and or screen, whichever one works. So that being said, Joe Neguse.
Thank you so much for everybody for being here for the 73rd Annual Conference on World Affairs. And I want to say thank you in particular to my very good friend, Shannon Watts, for having me on this panel. And what an honor and a privilege it is for me to be able to share the virtual stage with Shannon, who has done more in the cause for gun violence reform over the course of the last decade than any citizen I know. She has sacrificed so much and has really been on the front lines pushing each and every day to ensure that we take the necessary actions to save lives. And I'm so grateful for her activism, for her voice in this moment, and for having the opportunity to be able to join her today again on this panel. This conference is always such a highlight of the year for CU. I'm a former double buff. I went to undergrad and law school at the University of Colorado Boulder. And so I know just how much this conference means to our community. And my hope is that we're able to be in person next year. But nonetheless, wonderful to be able to have this virtually this year. And of course, I want to say thank you to Jayla for facilitating this important conversation. I want to address the tragedy that occurred in Boulder just a few weeks ago. There are almost no words to express how our community is feeling right now. Our hearts are broken. I know many of you watching today's program who live in Boulder County feel the same way. The loss of life is truly heartbreaking and unimaginable. I know that many folks are still in shock, in anguish, grieving, and certainly want you to know that we're with you. And while there's nothing that can be said to remove the pain or heal these wounds, we are certainly with you, and our office is always available as a resource as our community continues to heal and to grieve. As our community heals, we are reminded that this tragedy is not ours alone. It is one carried by a nation that has witnessed the horrific pain of gun violence far too many times. A nation reeling from a gun violence epidemic, as President Biden articulated yesterday. An epidemic that has taken far too many friends, parents, sisters, brothers, neighbors, colleagues, and cherished community members. Coloradans, unfortunately, are no stranger to gun violence. We mourn and we remember the lives of those lost at Columbine 21 years ago, in Aurora several years ago, and so many other tragic mass shootings in our state. And while Colorado knows these tragedies all too well, Coloradans have also been led to act. Advocates like Shannon and others across our state have continued working on this issue, calling for change and making their voices heard. Last year, during the State of the Union, I took as my guest a gentleman by the name of Tom Mauser. Many of you may know Tom. Tom tragically lost his son, Daniel, at age 15 in the Columbine shooting 21 years ago. He would be the same age that I am today had he survived. Tom turned that terrible grief into action. He put on his son Daniel's shoes, and he got to work advocating for change at the state level, inspiring a country. And he's not the only example. Tom Sullivan, a good friend of mine and of Shannon's, who lost his son tragically, Alex, in the Aurora movie theater shooting, likewise, every day wakes up and puts on his son's jacket and works to make change in his honor, now as a state representative in the Colorado General Assembly. Our state has taken some of the necessary measures. Colorado voters, because of people like Tom Mauser, closed the gun show loophole just 1 year after the Columbine tragedy by an overwhelming margin, actually, of 70% to 30%. Several years ago, we passed needed gun violence prevention measures, including universal background checks at the state level, as well as a red flag law, laws to keep guns from domestic abusers, and a high-capacity magazine ban. And yet Colorado remains at risk, since most states surrounding it have not passed these types of measures. Illegal guns can easily cross state lines, which is why measures have to be enacted nationally. As you heard Shannon so eloquently put it, the Congress has to muster the political will to change these laws at the federal level, to protect our communities, to protect Coloradans, to ensure violent tragedies like our community witnessed at a local grocery store never happen again. Meaningful, substantive action on this issue is long overdue, and I can certainly attest, as I've visited with so many constituents over the course of the last several weeks, that they are tired of excuses. We cannot allow the violence that has spiraled over the last 2 decades to be passed down to the next generation. There are many common sense reforms that we can enact, including universal background checks at the federal level, closing the Charleston loophole, and keeping weapons designed for battlefields away from our communities. These measures have broad support across the political spectrum, and they've proven effective in states that tried them. Now, we often hear that these situations are complex and that no one law would solve this issue. But neither of those explanations can be an excuse for inaction. If there's even one step that we can take to save another child, another parent, another friend, another community from this type of tragedy, then surely we must try. And we simply cannot allow tragedy and senseless violence, a loss of this magnitude, to continue to rip through our country with no response. Last week, I led over 100 of my colleagues in a letter to President Biden asking that his administration regulate the type of firearm that was used in the Boulder shooting, referred to as a concealable assault style firearm, The president included this step in his announced executive actions, which Shannon referenced just yesterday, and I was honored to join him in the Rose Garden at the White House as he made that announcement. But we know the work continues and that we cannot let up, that we have to continue to do all we can to keep our communities safe and to end the epidemic of gun violence. So I hope we can all commit to doing everything we can to saving lives for the sake of our communities and to ensure that we keep our citizens safe. We have to have the courage to do that and the courage to do it together. So I look forward to today's discussion. And again, thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Representative Neguse. The alliance being built between legislation and citizens is so needed and so very important. And you have acted as an exemplary figure for the community in working to reduce gun violence. We will now be transitioning to the portion of our panel where we accept questions from the audience. And I find that it's a little convenient that we have a question for you, Representative Neguse, which is, what do you need from us, the community, to help you pass these important laws, and how can we be most helpful in impacting?
Sorry, it wouldn't be a Zoom if I wasn't able to find them. Well, what a great question. Although, frankly, this question is a far better one for my colleague Shannon, because she has successfully marshaled, the ingenuity and the activism and the passion of literally millions of Americans over the course of the last decade in the cause for pushing for action to ultimately enact gun violence reform measures at the state, local, and federal level. So I'm going to defer to her because I think she's going to have far better advice as to how each of you can be effective to the extent that you share my worldview and I think Shannon's worldview on these issues. I would just simply say the one thing that I would ask is, to the extent that you are passionate about these issues and about saving lives in our community, that you speak up and speak out. We need more people speaking up and speaking out. And I will tell you that as I have had so many conversations with colleagues who have called to offer their condolences and their prayers and their thoughts to the people of Boulder on both sides of the aisle, I might say, they are listening, they are watching, they hear us, they hear you, and your voices are far more impactful than mine or any other public officials could be. And so I hope that each and every one of you will use your voices to make clear your desire, your demand for there to be a change.
It's such a great question. I never imagined I would be an activist. I was a mom and I had a career. And when the Sandy Hook school shooting tragedy happened, I knew nothing about gun violence. I knew nothing about organizing. I knew really nothing about the legislative process, than an average citizen would know. But I knew our nation was broken when it came to guns. And so I got online. I looked for something like Mothers Against Drunk Driving, which was a very influential organization when I was a teen in the 80s. And I couldn't find anything that was what I was looking for. I found some one-off think tanks run by men. I found some one-off state organizations, again, mostly run by men. And I wanted to be part of a badass army of women. It's frankly who I've seen get things done over and over again in this country, all the way back to suffrage and civil rights and child labor laws up to the water crisis in Flint, Michigan. And so I just created a Facebook page thinking, okay, we'll have an online conversation about this. And it's, well, if you know anything about type A women, it turned into the largest offline organization in the country, one of the largest grassroots movements, not just for gun violence prevention, but in general. And that was because so many brilliant people, and we're not just moms anymore, we're mothers and others and students, but so many brilliant women in those early days brought their skill sets that I didn't have to the table. And we decided, we don't really know what we're doing, but we're not going to let that stop us. We're going to learn as we go. I call it in my book, building the plane as you fly it. Because if I had waited to know everything there was to know about this issue, I still wouldn't have started Moms Demand Action. There was a lot to learn. And I also think sometimes women, and maybe this applies to high school and college aged people too, but I was afraid to fail. And I decided that it was not an option to not put myself out there, right? If I lost my own children, If I lost children in my community, there was nothing left to lose. And so I made the leap. And obviously it paid off because it was time in this country for this movement. And the last thing I'll say is, I am a white suburban mom. I only got off the sidelines because I was afraid my kids weren't safe in their schools. Shame on me, shame on other white women and Americans who waited way too long to get involved in this issue. Black and brown women have been doing this work for decades with very little visibility. But I think it's on all of us to get involved in activism. Alice Walker talks about how activism is the price we pay to live on the planet. And it's true. You can't count on other people to do the activism for you, even if you just have an hour a week. It matters. Activism is like drips on a rock, right? I call it the unglamorous heavy lifting of grassroots activism. It all matters, it all adds up, and it all counts. And so I would say find some issue that you are passionate about. It may not be gun violence, but get involved. Jayla mentioned that I wrote a book. All the proceeds go to gun violence prevention organizations. And it really does outline how I was able to work with others to create this organization and the lessons I learned. And so if you're interested in being an activist, I'd highly recommend checking it out.
Thank you for your contribution to the discussion on getting involved as being one of the most important things that we can do as people. I also have someone who was curious as to the road trip around America that you're working on with Letters for Senators.
Yes,
Are you picking up letters from chapters along the way is one of the biggest questions being asked here.
Yes, so what I have to say, it brings me a lot of joy that while the NRA is tied up in bankruptcy court this week and for the coming several weeks, our 6 million supporters, yes, we are larger than the NRA now, we are demanding more than thoughts and prayers from lawmakers, and we are trekking across the country all the way to DC to push the Senate to act on background checks. And so over the next 10 days, I guess now 8, groups of our volunteers are making over 60 COVID safe stops in 22 states for this road trip for background checks. It's basically a 16,000 mile long cross-country trip that will end in DC and call on the Senate to act. You can follow it with, I think the hashtag is road trip, the number 4 BGC. And you can also go to momsdemandaction.org. You can go to our Instagram. Students Demand Action is highlighting it too. See if it's coming to where you live, if you want to get involved, or get involved virtually. But we have to keep the pressure on.
And you brought up such an important point. So one of the questions that came up was, how would you say that the NRA's downfall is changing the dynamic of the fight for gun control?
Yeah, and I would love to hear Representative Neguse's thoughts on this too as a sitting member of Congress. But the landscape, the political landscape has changed so much. Yes, I've talked about how they're bankrupt, but they're under investigation on many fronts. Their power has been dwindling for over a decade now. In fact, if you go back to 2008 when Barack Obama was elected president, about a quarter of all Democrats in Congress had an A rating from the NRA. Today, none do. In fact, in 2020, the very last member of Congress with an A rating from the NRA on the Democratic side lost his seat. And it goes to show that our grassroots movement is really showing, as I said earlier, lawmakers, if you do the right thing, we'll have your back. If you do the wrong thing, we'll have your job. Then flash forward to 2013. And just months after the Sandy Hook school shooting tragedy, there was a vote on a bill called Manchin-Toomey. It was a bipartisan bill between Senators Manchin and Toomey that would close the background check loophole, really in honor of this tragedy that had just happened. And I can remember sitting in the Senate gallery that day, and we lost by just a handful of votes. And some of the people who voted, some of the senators who voted against Manchin-Toomey were Democrats. Not a single one of those senators still holds their job. And the reason is that they learned a very important lesson. The Democrats who voted against background checks thought the NRA would protect them, What did they do? They went in and they invested in their Republican opponents right after. So a good example is Mark Pryor, senator from Arkansas, voted against background checks. The NRA turned right around and invested millions of dollars in Tom Cotton's campaign. And it really taught Democrats a valuable lesson, which was, with friends like the NRA, who needs enemies? And so after that, Democrats have felt free to vote their conscience. Now, we can't win if just Democrats support background checks. I think it is in many ways like marriage equality. When marriage equality activists went to Congress and demanded marriage equality, the so-called gift they got in return was the Defense of Marriage Act, which was exactly the opposite of what they wanted. So they pivoted and started doing this grassroots work in the communities where they lived, in state houses, in boardrooms, in school boards, and city councils. And eventually that pointed the country in the right direction. It is the same with our issue. Our volunteers pivoted after the Manchin-Toomey loss and started doing this work in state houses and in boardrooms. And we've passed background checks in 22 states, red flag laws in 19. We've closed the Charleston loophole in 19 states. We've disarmed domestic abusers in 29 states. We have a 90% track record of beating the NRA's agenda year after year for the last 5 years. We have changed hundreds of corporate policies. We have educated people about secure gun storage. We're doing all of these things and building momentum that we knew eventually would point the right president and the right Congress in the right direction. And I think that's why today we are on the precipice of major national change. We do have more Republican support than we used to. We're having good, productive conversations with Republicans, but Representative Neguse, I would love to hear your perspective of what it's like to sit in Congress and see both sides.
Sure. Well, I don't know that I could provide a better answer because you are the one that's gone toe to toe with the NRA for so many years. I would say it's worth underscoring just how momentous a day yesterday was when you have, kind of on the one hand, the NRA literally in bankruptcy court, as Shannon said, amidst many other investigations of that organization, and juxtaposed against that, you have a president who was one of the leaders of gun violence reform in the United States Senate long before he became president, announcing a series of executive actions designed to save lives, and arguably the most far-reaching executive orders, certainly in a decade. To me, as I think about what our country has experienced over the course of the last quarter century and the many mass shootings, the tragedies that have occurred in community after community, and the inability of the federal government to do anything about it or to have the political will necessary to do anything about it, I do think Shannon is right that we are finally on the precipice of that changing. And you can see that in both the way in which the NRA's influence has clearly waned significantly. You read stories about their influence in the Democratic caucus decades ago. Of course, I'm new to Congress, but long before I got there, and it sounds completely foreign because the truth is they have no influence within the Democratic caucus today. Obviously, that's not to say that the same goes for the Republican caucus. And yet, as Shannon said, we made some significant progress in building bipartisan support within the Congress for some of the common sense gun violence prevention measures that Shannon and Moms Demand have been championing for so many years. And perhaps that's the best place for me to end, which is to say, in the states where Moms Demand has made such significant progress, you heard Shannon mention 29 states where you've been able to achieve various reforms. Many of those states are not blue states. And I think the difference has been the rise of a countervailing force, moms, parents, survivors, folks from all walks of life in America saying enough is enough and having the tough, candid conversations with their neighbors and their family members and community members who might have a different worldview than their own about gun ownership in America, but nonetheless are reasonable and do believe that we should have some type of restrictions and regulations to ultimately ensure that folks are safe in their communities. And so for me, I think that's the difference. That's what's changed in the past several years. And again, not to belabor the point, I think that's in large part because of Shannon and because of Moms Demand and other organizations like it that have, I think, galvanized the American public, and in turn are now holding representatives like myself and all my colleagues in Congress accountable.
And I just say, I love the dynamic here. You guys are so great. So Representative Neguse, somebody would like to know what measures and reforms has Colorado taken that makes us a leader, and where are we falling short as a state?
That's a great question. As I mentioned, Colorado has done quite a bit. And again, I think that I credit the incredible people in our state who have lost loved ones to gun violence, who over the course of the last several decades have really led the charge. As I mentioned, people like Tom Sullivan, people like Tom Mauser, the latter of whom helped close the gun show loophole by virtue of the amendment that Colorado voters passed 20 years ago, give or take. We've passed a series of laws at the state level that we are now trying to emulate at the federal level. The best example would be universal background checks, which we passed in the wake of the terrible tragedy in Aurora many years ago, as well as the red flag laws, which were recently approved by Colorado, approved by the Colorado legislature, championed by Representative Sullivan, whom I mentioned. That's a concept that we are now very much trying to create at the federal level. Representative Macbeth, who is a good friend of, a mutual friend of mine and of Shannon's, and a former Moms Demand staffer who did a lot of work with Moms Demand. She has a bill right now to do so at the federal level. And of course, President Biden yesterday, with the help of our new Attorney General, announced a new initiative designed to essentially encourage states to adopt model red flag legislation. Although I think there's a lot more that we could do in Colorado as far as the red flag law is concerned to make sure that people are aware of it, because clearly there's more that can be done on that front, on an educational standpoint. The legislature, there are a number of other steps that I suspect that the legislature is going to consider. And that includes, obviously, the state has already banned high capacity magazines. The state does not have an assault weapons ban, while some states do have that. Of course, at the federal level, we're working very hard to try to reinstate the federal ban, which was in effect from 1994 to 2004, and which the president spoke about just yesterday. So look, at the end of the day, I think we have incredible champions in Colorado, the people that I mentioned, people like Senator Rhonda Fields, so many others who have a very visceral connection to this work and to this issue. And I trust that they're going to continue to make progress here in our state.
And on that note, in developing progress, and of course, you guys are more than welcome to banter this a little bit. How do we change the gun culture that permeates society? Laws can only go so far, especially since there are already so many guns out there in the public.
So, the way we look at it is that this issue can be broken up into essentially 3 buckets, and that's how we work on it. So we've talked a lot about legislation. That's certainly a big bucket. Playing offense and defense, passing good bills and stopping bad bills. And it's important to remember that even though the NRA spent tens of millions of dollars on Donald Trump's campaign, we were able to stop them from passing a single piece of priority legislation the 2 years they had both a Republican president and a Republican Congress, right? So it is important to play defense and offense legislatively. The other bucket is electoral politics. And it does matter who you vote for. And for too long, the silent majority, because about 90% of all Americans support stronger gun laws, they were not prioritizing this issue. And so the vocal minority, many of them gun extremists, were essentially getting to write our nation's gun laws. Now, I do think Moms Demand Action has played a huge role in getting Americans to make this a voting priority, particularly among women, and particularly among Black and brown women who care very much about this issue. And when you vote on this issue, it makes a difference. And I'll give you an example. When I started doing this work back in 2012, if you had told me that Virginia would be a gun-sense state within 6 years, I would have said you were nuts. But we have such a strong chapter there. They are a political powerhouse. And when Republicans refused to act after the mass shooting in Virginia Beach, they doubled down. And they were able to flip both chambers of the General Assembly. And that was in 2019. A few months later, 7 good gun sense laws were signed by the governor. They're passed and signed. And I think now almost a total of 10. It has completely changed the face of gun safety in the state of Virginia. And I think Colorado is a good example too, where the NRA really thought they were going to hold sway over lawmakers there. And in fact, they recalled 2 lawmakers after stronger gun laws were passed. But since then, we have worked so hard to maintain a gun sense majority, and we've been able to do that. And now Colorado has a whole host of good gun laws, and they're getting ready to pass more. Representative Neguse mentioned our friend Leslie Herod, who is championing police reform and lost and stolen gun legislation and just doing amazing things in that state. So electoral politics is incredibly important to change the culture of gun violence. But third is cultural work. And that includes influencers like celebrities and athletes and authors and others, getting them on the same page to use their influence to educate and make others understand the importance of this issue. It's teaching people about secure gun storage. We have a program called Be Smart. 5 million American kids in this country live in homes with unsecured guns. And when we talk about school shootings, so often we act like it's some rando who walked in off the street. No, it is a student who had easy access to guns in their homes. And so when we teach people that they need to keep their guns locked, unloaded, separate from ammunition, it saves lives and changes the culture, right? We are not against the Second Amendment. Many of our volunteers are gun owners or their partners are gun owners. As you mentioned, there's 400 million guns in this country. This is simply about restoring the responsibilities that should go along with gun rights. And the only place that is a polarizing issue is in the US Senate. It is not out in the American public.
Yeah, I mean, Shannon said it so well. And I think in particular, I guess the latter category you mentioned, the last category of your work, as I think about the statistic that you referenced, so on universal background checks, 90% of Americans supporting universal background checks. As we unpack that, what does that mean? That means that a whole lot of liberal Americans, conservative Americans, Americans who have no political affiliation at all, support that reasonable reform. 85% of gun-owning households support universal background checks. So as Shannon said, I actually think that most of the reforms that we talk about, and I think that we're focused on in Congress, are broadly supported by the American people, including most gun owners. And I think part of the challenge going forward, which I think has been the case for several years, and Shannon's organization, Moms Demand, is a great example of an organization that's doing this effectively, is having candid, in some cases difficult, conversations with folks who, again, might have a different worldview than our own, because I think those conversations ultimately will lead to a place where we can have broad-based support within the United States Congress for some of these reforms. I've had a number of these conversations with folks who, again, have very different worldview than my own, very different political views than my own, and a different view of the breadth of the Second Amendment and gun violence reform legislation. And yet, when I start from the baseline proposition in those conversations of not impugning their motives, but essentially trying to better understand whether they would agree that all Americans fundamentally should be able to feel safe in their church, in their movie theater, in their grocery store, in their school, which I think virtually every American agrees with. And then working backwards from there about some of these reasonable reforms that ultimately, as I said, would save lives, but also are broadly supported by the American public. I think you will find that there's more support at the grassroots level for these reforms than certainly the NRA and other organizations would tell. I think the American public, there's far more consensus within the American public and within communities across our country than folks would give us credit for. And so we've just got to figure out a way to harness that consensus and ensure that that consensus ultimately is achieved and effectuated in the halls of government. And I think we've done a good job of that at the state level. Where we fail to do so is at the federal level. And although we're making progress in the House, and now, as Shannon said, it may be that the last place for us to jump that final hurdle is the United States Senate.
Great. And on the topic of political division, are those who are trying to pass gun legislation engaging those who support reasonable Second Amendments and the advocacy surrounding it, and figuring out ways that we can prevent gun violence? If so, what legislation do you think that that we all can get passed, and would creating a unifying goal for both sides be beneficial?
Yeah, I think sometimes we think about or talk about this issue as being polarizing. And as Representative Neguse just said, it's really not. When you do polling of Americans, 93% support common sense gun laws like background checks. 89% of gun owners support those same laws, as do 87% of Republicans, right? And certainly as you start to talk about different specific laws, that those numbers may change, but there's still overwhelming support for acting. And so our focus, our priorities, and different organizations have different priorities. We are a very moderate, nonpartisan organization because we believe that we have to get Republicans and Democrats on the right side of history in order to get the change we need that will last forever, right? That will last into perpetuity. When you look at what is most needed based on data, that's another thing that our organization is completely focused on. So the policies we support, the laws we fight for, they need to be shown by data for the most part to work. Or we try to go into one state, pass that law, and then look at the data and see if that will work, and then extrapolate those laws to the rest of the country. But what we know is at the center of a holistic and effective gun safety system in this country would be to require a background check on every gun sale. And right now, you only have to perform a background check if you are a licensed dealer. And if that gun has not cleared, if that gun buyer has not cleared his background check within 3 days, that licensed dealer has the right to go ahead and sell the gun anyway. It's called the Charleston loophole. It's how the gunman who killed 9 Black parishioners in a Charleston church was able to get his gun. He was a prohibited purchaser. He had a complicated criminal history. It took more than 3 days for his background check to clear. Licensed dealer sold him the gun anyway, totally legal. So a background check system, closing loopholes like the Charleston loophole, has huge support and is necessary because right now, unlicensed gun sales do not require a background check. We have closed that loophole in 22 states like Colorado, but in 28 states, you can go online and buy a gun and make an in-person transfer. You can, in some cases, go to a garage sale. You can go to a gun show, and you can buy a gun from an unlicensed dealer, and they are not required to perform a background check. About a quarter of all guns are sold in this country every year without a background check. And that's how domestic abusers and prohibited purchasers and dangerous people get their hands on guns. Okay, so that's the foundation. But there are other things that we know would be effective. So for example, there is a loophole in federal law that when the Violence Against Women Act was written, it didn't include dating partners and stalkers because most women were getting married younger. But today, you're as likely to be shot by an intimate partner who is your dating partner as you are your spouse. So we need to go in and require dating partners and obviously stalkers to be prohibited purchasers if they've committed domestic violence. The Violence Against Women Act has not been reauthorized now for I think something like 2 years. Joe, you probably know better than I do, but the reason is because it contains a new provision that the NRA considers a poison pill that would close that loophole. We call it the boyfriend loophole. If we were able to reauthorize the Violence Against Women Act, which again has broad support, it would go a long way towards saving lives. And the last law, I would talk about is a red flag law, and that was something we've also passed in Colorado, 19 states so far. And a red flag law simply allows, depending on the state, families or police to get a temporary restraining order that removes guns from someone who seems to be a risk to themselves or others. And data has shown us that this is an effective way to interrupt gun suicide, domestic gun violence, mass shootings, and other forms of gun violence. It's obvious. There are often, and in fact, there are almost always red flags, warning signs before someone dies by gun suicide or commits a mass shooting. And so to have that law at a federal level would be incredibly life-saving and important as well. And Joe, I know you all have worked on legislation and have your own priorities too.
No, every single bill that you just mentioned, which, by the way, with the exception of the red flag law, are bills that the House of Representatives has already passed. I mean, that we passed within the first 8 of the, correct, but in the last Congress, in the 116th, and then in the 117th Congress, with, by the way, Republican votes. I mean, many House Republicans ultimately voting for universal background checks, for the reauthorization of VAWA. And so, again, it's unfortunately the test now is whether or not we can get these bills across the finish line in the United States Senate, which is why the work that Shannon and Moms Demand is doing in the road trip across the country to make their voices heard is so important.
So on the topic of the red flag law, from my understanding, it includes so many different parts, some of which are on the issue of mental health, where those that believe that that someone around them may be struggling with mental health, they can submit a report in some sense or another, and ultimately state, I don't believe that this person is mentally well enough to have a gun. So can you discuss what measures either of you are working on to increase mental health support to decrease gun violence?
So, anytime we talk about mental health and gun violence, it's so important to point out that we have the same rates of mental illness in this country as other high-income countries. Yet we have a 25 times higher gun homicide rate than any other high-income country. So when there are horrific shooting tragedies, often we hear Republicans pivot to, it's not the guns, it's mental health. The truth is, people who are mentally ill are much more likely to be victims of violent crime than to be perpetrators. That said, do we have a mental health crisis in this country, especially given the pandemic? Absolutely. And there have to be things done to get help to those people who are experiencing a mental health crisis. When you talk about red flag laws, there is due process. These laws have been found to be constitutionally sound so that a court can hear what the case is and make their own determinations about whether this person is a risk to themselves or others and whether their guns should be temporarily removed. So again, this would be a very effective and important law at a federal level. In terms of background checks, if you have been adjudicated as mentally ill, that would theoretically go into the background check system, which is itself full of flaws and loopholes because we haven't invested in it. But it would make you a prohibited purchaser, again, if you have been adjudicated mentally ill by the government. And then Joe, do you want to talk about things that Congress is focused on in terms of mental health?
Definitely. I would say this, I think, and I certainly agree with Shannon, that we have to take action to prevent gun violence. And the best way to do that, in my view, is to pursue the common sense measures that we've been talking about today, like universal background checks, red flag laws, many other bills that we've mentioned. But we also know there's no panacea. Ultimately, it's going to take a comprehensive set of solutions, and part of that kind of panoply of solutions that we pursue at the federal level has to also be mental health funding and addressing what I think can be fairly described, as Shannon said, a mental health crisis in our country. There are a number of different proposals that have been made over the course of the last several years since I've been in Congress to try to address the scale of that crisis. That includes, restoring parity with respect to insurance coverage so that folks can have easier access to mental health services. It includes scaling up through the incentivization of development for mental health professionals, right? Counselors and others in those fields, in particular in parts of our state and other parts of the country where there is a clear shortage in that regard. Secretary Becerra, who's the new Secretary of Health and Human Services, has indicated this will be a top priority of his as they think about what they could do on the regulatory side. So I certainly think this is something that we should work on and that I'm passionate about, and I think that folks are passionate about across the political spectrum. With respect to the red flag laws, I would just add, and Shannon is completely right with respect to the fact that it's clearly has due process and is constitutional. I don't think there's any question about that. I do think that there is an education gap, and one that we're going to have to really focus in on here in our state, because we have this law that we know has worked and has saved lives in its infancy. We haven't had the law for that long in terms of since it went into effect. But I do think that there's more that can be done from an awareness standpoint of educating folks in our communities that this law is available and that folks can utilize it. My understanding thus far is that most invocations of the law have been by law enforcement, not necessarily by family. And so, I think everybody who's attending today's Zoom presentation, I suspect, has a special role in our community. Some of you may be teachers. Some of you, may work at a local nonprofit or involved in other common institutions, societal institutions here in our community. And I think there's a real opportunity to just make sure that folks are aware and that you all can help get the word out about the law and its various provisions so that we can hopefully save lives in the future.
All right, and as we wrap up our portion where we take audience questions, there are a few more here. One is, having discussed how much Colorado's already done to reduce or eliminate gun violence, what do you all believe fell short with the system in the recent Boulder shooting? And how was that individual able to pass the background checks in order to obtain his gun? What could have been done differently?
I would say I think that that's an inquiry that the state legislature and law enforcement in our state, both locally in the community as well as at the state level in terms of the Department of Public Safety, are fully engaged in right now. And so I wouldn't want to get ahead of them as they engage in that work to figure out whether or not there are, for example, improvements that need to be made to the universal background check system that we have in Colorado that would potentially ensure that there are, for example, a broader spectrum of serious crimes that would trigger the universal background check system. But in any event, I don't know that I want to get ahead of them as they're making those deliberations.
And I would just add, details are emerging. So we don't know the full story. We do know that he used a brace on his gun, and that brace was actually is going to be regulated now by the executive actions taken yesterday by Joe Biden. That brace made his gun even more dangerous and more deadly. And the other thing I would say is, so often after a shooting tragedy, people will, say on Twitter or on social media, tell me what law would have stopped that gun violence. Well, they're just like car accidents. There's not necessarily one law that will stop all gun violence. If you go back to the 70s and 80s, when there were so many vehicle deaths, our country said, we've got to fix this. Too many people are dying on our roads. And it wasn't like they passed seatbelts and said, okay, that's it. We've done our part here. And it's also not like people don't still die when they wear seatbelts. They do. We don't then take all of the seatbelts out of cars. We passed seatbelt laws. We passed speed limits. We put rumble strips on streets. We enhanced car technology. We require insurance and tests and license and so many different things that have made car safety safer. When it comes to gun violence, we have not even tried trying. We haven't tried anything. And so what we need is a safety net that will reduce, not prevent all deaths, that will reduce gun violence deaths. 100 Americans are shot and killed every day. Over 200 are wounded. We can do simple things to stop many of those deaths. They are senseless and they are preventable. And so it drives me nuts when people act like because someone passed a background check legally and then shot someone that, oh, I guess we don't need any gun laws. That isn't the lens we apply to any other laws in this country. We don't say someone didn't stop at a stop sign, so let's pull them all out of the ground, right? So again, gun violence prevention is about pulling together laws that we know work based on data in the states where they've passed, putting them in place at a federal level, and then continuing to monitor them, looking at data, looking at science, making investments, and saving lives.
All right, and for the sake of time, this will be our final question. With someone being ready to really get civically involved with the issue of gun control and laws, for those wanting to get involved in this sort of activism, what are the most effective 2 to 3 best steps to take to get started helping?
Well, from my perspective at Moms Demand Action, again, you don't have to be a mom or a woman. You can be we call them mothers and others, or as you know, Jayla, you can be a student. So you can either text the word ready to 64433. You can go to momsdemandaction.org. I love the Students Demand Action's Instagram page. It's fantastic. And I would also ask all of you to text the word checks to 64433 and right now be connected to your US Senator and tell them that you demand background checks to get a vote and to get passed. And get involved in your community. If you text the word ready to 64433, a volunteer will call you back very shortly and they will say, here's how you can plug in where you live. And again, if you're passionate about legislation or electoral politics or educating people about secure storage or getting involved at your high school or college, whatever it is, we will make sure that you're able to do that and we'll make it very easy for you to make a difference.
Absolutely. I've really enjoyed being a volunteer. You guys keep me busy. I'm 17 years old and you keep me young, so.
Well, and I was just going to say, Jayla, I know you're interviewing us, but can you give us kind of your perspective of this issue as a high school student?
Sure. So most of the work that I do is in racial advocacy. So I'm a part of the Denver Public Schools Student Board of Education, where I work a little bit on passing policies. One of the ones that I'm working on is requiring culture and diversity licenses for grade school teachers. But I think
How about with gun? What's your experience with Students Demand Action and gun violence?
Yes, of course. With Students Demand Action and gun violence, that is a lot of my primary focus as well. But of course, the two are very much so interconnected. With Students Demand Action, I originally got involved through a class where we have to get civically engaged. It's a global politics class. My experience has been absolutely fascinating, especially starting my own chapter at school and watching it grow. It's like watering a flower. It's very fun. So my advice, of course, is there are a million ways to get involved. And if getting up and speaking isn't quite your thing, then I'm sure that there's something else. There are so many people to talk to in the activism community where we need to send emails and have important discussions. But more than anything, it's really just deciding that it has to be done rather than getting up one day and saying that I'm going to force myself to take the steps. Making that decision is the very first and the best thing that you can do.
My advice is everything that Jayla and Shannon have
Exactly.
said. I'm going to leave it there.
Just follow Jayla.
Thank you. All right, so with our remaining time, I want to offer you both the opportunity to provide closing statements that hopefully resonate with our audience.
Hopefully. Well, I just want to thank you so much for inviting me to join today. Jayla, thank you for your work with Students Demand Action. I know the fight can be exhausting, but I am so encouraged that we're making progress and passing the baton to your generation that is not content with the status quo. It took me years to find my voice, and so to see young people like you speak up and speak out and hold elected officials accountable is so inspiring. And to my friend, Representative Neguse, I was so proud to be represented by you when I lived in Boulder. I'm so in awe of your courage and your partnership. This community is so fortunate to have you as their representative in Congress, truly. And to everyone tuning in, I hope we've inspired you to get off the sidelines and act too. Just yesterday, as we talked about, Joe Biden announced a bold and aggressive plan to combat this issue. He announced some much needed executive actions that will start saving lives right away. And now we need the Senate to pass the life-saving bills that Representative Neguse and his colleagues passed last month. So call your senators, tell them you want to see action right now. And again, if you text the word checks, CHECKS to 64433, we will walk you through the process. And thank you again so much for inviting me to join you today.
Well, it's incredibly difficult to follow my good friend Shannon. There's something that she said today that is going to stay with me when I go back to Washington next week, which is that policymakers haven't even tried trying. What an incredibly succinct and concise and devastating description of the inaction of at least our federal policymakers for the better part of the last 25 years. You cannot say the same for Shannon and for her organization and for all of the legions of activists and moms across the country who've showed up, who have stood up for gun violence reform. And I would simply say that this conversation has motivated me again and anew to continue the push to make those common sense reforms a reality in the United States Congress. At a time of such great cynicism and a time when community after community is devastated by the tragedies of gun violence, one could, it's reasonable to ask, where do you find hope in that? And for me, where do you find optimism in that? And for me, I suspect my answer is a similar one to the one that Shannon offered, which was I find optimism in Jayla. I find hope in Jayla and her cohort, in the young people that I think this next generation that will succeed our own, that are so well poised and well positioned to be able to solve some of these consequential challenges that we face as a country and as a society. And gun violence is clearly at the very top of that list. And I find hope and optimism in organizations like Moms Demand and in people like Shannon, who year after year, notwithstanding all of the vitriol and the attacks, the hurdles and the obstacles, continue pushing because they know that it's the right thing to do and that eventually we'll make progress. So I thank them for their activism and their voices. And I hope that those of you who are watching will lift your voices up as well in support of common sense gun violence prevention, because I think if you do, ultimately we'll save lives. And I thank you for the opportunity to be here.
Well, I'd like to thank you both for being here. But that should conclude our panel. Again, thank you for joining us. If you'd like to support our guests and learn more about their work, you can find their books, podcasts, and social media accounts linked on the CWA website. The CWA relies on the generosity of people like our audience to make the event possible. So please consider providing a gift to the CWA, which can also be done at www.colorado.edu/CWA. Tune in through Sunday, April 11th for live CWA events, or catch up on those you missed on the CWA YouTube channel. Thank you both so much.
Thank you.